See you later. Take care. Have a good day. Don't worry, I'll be back around 7 p.m. As I opened the front door, the dazzling morning sun greeted me. Turning around, my wife, dressed in an apron, was waving goodbye with a smile. It was the very image of the married life I had always dreamed of. I was so happy to see that dream come true. My name is Tyler. Things at work were going great. At 29, I was starting to get recognized and earn a decent position. Although the responsibility is heavier, it is more rewarding, and most importantly, the salary has increased. I'm saving this money for my wife, and for our future child. With that in mind, I've been giving my all at work. But the problem arose less than a year after we got married. We had been trying, but we couldn't seem to have a child. Maybe we should get checked at the hospital, just to be sure. One day, I suggested this to my wife. But she said, "There's no need to rush, is there? Let's just be patient." She said that, gently refusing to go to the hospital. At the time, I only thought there might be a slight misalignment between us regarding children, but one comment from a mutual friend changed everything. It was when I was on the phone with that friend, talking about going fishing, which is a hobby of ours. "Hey, by the way, did you guys have a kid?" he asked cheerily, but I was stunned. "A kid? No, we haven't. Really? Because, you know, I had a cold recently, right? When I was at the clinic, I saw your wife coming out of the obstetrics and gynecology department." According to my friend, it was a momentary event, and he didn't have time to say hello. My wife, who didn't want to go to the hospital, was secretly at the OBGYN. Why would she be there? I had a bad feeling. At least, I couldn't understand why she would go there without telling me. So after dinner, I told my wife we needed to talk and had her sit down. When I brought up what the friend had mentioned, I didn't miss the brief moment of panic in her reaction. "You must be mistaken. I haven't been to such a place." My wife looked me straight in the eye and said that. I left it at that for the moment, but remembering a line from a TV show, that a woman doesn't look away when she lies, only deepened my distrust. So, I decided to hire a detective. What came back was astonishing. The detective's report on my wife's whereabouts revealed that she kept changing hospitals and was still visiting the OBGYN. I asked the detective to check her financial activity, and we took a look at her bank account. There were large sums of money recently withdrawn. When I reported this to the detective, he looked grim. If that large sum of money was used at the gynecologist's, there's probably only one thing it could have been for. And what's that? An abortion. Hearing those words, I went completely blank. Why? How could this happen? I mumbled, but the detective mentioned something troubling. "Actually, it appears there's another man in the picture with your wife." I felt as if I had been hit over the head with a blunt object. "Haha, you're joking, right?" I burst out laughing dryly, but when the detective showed me a picture of my wife with a strange man, I couldn't laugh any longer. I had been betrayed by my wife. Then, I confronted her with both the photos of her entering the OBGYN and her meeting the man in secret. At first, she tried to explain it away as a misunderstanding, but ultimately, she admitted to the affair. "I'm truly disappointed. Why did you do this?" Past anger, I struggled to hold back tears as I squeezed out the words. Then, through her sobbing, she said, "Forgive me, it was a moment of weakness. You've been so busy lately. And then I was approached by a senior from my college days, but the child I aborted was his. I didn't want to have a child with anyone but you, so that's why. Come to think of it, there had been several large withdrawals from my wife's bank account." When I pressed for details, it turned out that she had secretly conducted a DNA test when she found out she was pregnant. That must have been what the money was for. In her mind, she must have thought that all the effort she put in was to prove her love for me, but when I heard that, anger surged within me again. Don't be ridiculous. How selfish can you be? You had an abortion because it was your lover's child. If you were going to do something like that, you shouldn't have cheated in the first place. What you've done is nothing less than murder, I shouted. I just went off screaming. It was the only way I could keep from hitting her. She kept apologizing, but sorry wasn't going to cut it anymore. Then I told her it was over. When I told my in-laws, they actually got down on their knees and apologized. They had contributed to our wedding and had been really good to us until now, so it was sad to say goodbye this way. Despite everything, I ended up demanding a hefty alimony from my wife's lover. I even informed his company about the affair, and later heard he got fired and seems to be drowning in debt now. Serves him right, I thought, feeling a bit hollow, but the damage I suffered from this ordeal was beyond imagination. All I was left with was a bit of a bonus in the form of alimony. The happy everyday life with the wife and kids I loved was now a dream that would never come true again. After that, I just couldn't put my heart into my work anymore. I had managed because I had a family. I just couldn't keep the motivation going. My colleagues were somewhat understanding of my downheartedness due to my wife's infidelity, but it was clear they were troubled by my listless performance. Sensing this, I submitted my resignation. "Are you sure, after all you've worked for?" my boss said, but I told him I didn't want to be a burden anymore and that I wanted to start fresh somewhere new. In the end, he accepted my resignation. "You'll make it anywhere. Keep your chin up," he said. My boss gave me a shout out. Honestly, I was close to tears. Having almost lost faith in people because of my wife's betrayal, his words made me feel like I could try again. Then, at 30, I switched jobs. Sure, the salary took a significant hit, and my seniors are all younger than me, but everyone was so kind that I slowly felt my smile return after feeling emotionless since the affair. Still, whenever female colleagues spoke to me, I couldn't help but wonder if they were lying, which became a bit of a worry for me. But even I found a new beginning. It was with Susan, the office clerk. She was 5 years older than me. Always smiling and incredibly smart, she was the go-to person for everyone. We started off just exchanging greetings, but one day, our overtime hours overlapped. That's when we began to chat more personally and discovered a shared passion for fishing, which brought us closer. But what really connected us was finding out that Susan, like me, was also divorced. "So, Susan, you were married too?" "Yes, it's been a year already." Coincidentally, the timing of her divorce was close to when my ex-wife and I split up. It was really the worst. I lost the kids to my ex-husband. He must have hired a good lawyer. Even though infidelity was the cause, Susan's expression was very regretful. "I get to see my kids once a month, but ever since then, I've felt all alone. Lost my husband and my children. Lost everything important all at once." "I get that. I understand how you feel. I had dreams too, you know. I wanted to have a kid to play catch with. I was in the baseball club in high school, not a strong team, but I was a regular. If my kid took an interest in baseball, I'd love to pass on the skills I learned. I've had that fantasy." "Your ex-wife was quite something. You've done well to bounce back. That's impressive." Susan gently patted my head as she said that. I was so surprised that my face felt like it was on fire. Maybe this is the confidence of someone older. Simple as it may seem, that moment sparked my interest in Susan. Even I, who had become distrustful of women, could believe the words of Susan, who shared a similar fate. So one day, I took a chance and confessed my feelings to her. And Susan, who said she could forget her loneliness when she was with me, accepted my feelings. We started dating, and before long, we were married. We'd definitely be happy. We promised each other that this time. But life, it just doesn't always work out the way you plan. It's been 3 years since I divorced my first wife. And it's almost a year since Susan and I got married. Lately, though, things between Susan and me haven't been so great. I got transferred to a new division and had to travel a lot for work, which seems to be bothering Susan. "You're not cheating, are you?" She kept asking me that over and over. I guess the trauma from her previous husband has left her feeling insecure. But no matter how many times I've reassured her, she speaks as if it's a given that I would cheat, which has started to really irritate me. "Why don't you trust me?" I snapped. Because men cheat, don't they? What's that supposed to mean? If anything, it's women who are the cheaters. That made Susan burst into tears. Constantly checking and doubting each other. Our daily life had become anything but happy. Despite both of us having pasts where we've been betrayed and hurt, it's those very pasts that are now causing us to hurt each other. Caught in this negative spiral, both Susan and I were worn out. And with my long business trips piling up, we started talking less and less. Then, I was assigned another trip. "Well, I'll be gone for about a week. Take care of the house, will you?" "Yeah, safe trip." Susan's face looked incredibly sad. Every time I'm away on a business trip, she must suspect I'm cheating on her. It's utterly baseless. If anything, it's Susan who might be having another man over at our house. I have that suspicion too. We were both exhausted. If we're just going to doubt each other, maybe it'd be better if we split up. While harboring such thoughts, I was working at my temporary assignment. A few days later, I had finished my day's work and was about to head to the hotel. Then, on my way, I found a park. A wave of nostalgia hit me. This was actually the place where I used to live with my ex-wife, and where we often came during our dates, holding hands. I used to ask her there, "Shall we play catch here with our kid?" She'd laugh and say it was too cramped for anything but a wiffle ball. I felt a lump in my throat. Despite being from an affair, there was no doubt a child in my wife's womb. That child had every right to live in this world. And yet, we took it away for adult reasons. Had it been born to different parents, its future could have been different. No, if I had known about it before my wife decided on the abortion, I could have stopped it, raised that child myself. Maybe then, I could have played catch with them. Being called dad by them. I chuckled bitterly at the fantasy. There's no way I could be kind to a child from an affair. I already feel so torn up just knowing Susan meets with her ex's child. A mix of frustration and sorrow overwhelmed me at that moment. "Daddy," I heard a child's voice. It surely wasn't meant for me. But I turned around anyway. For some reason, I thought the voice was calling out to me. And there they were, a child and his mother. The kid I recognized from a photo. I believe his name was George. And the mother, of course, I knew. She was my wife, Susan. "Susan, what are you doing here?" I asked, and Susan looked just as surprised. "I thought we might bump into each other," Susan murmured, with a meaningful look. As it turned out, it was just a coincidence that today was the once-a-month day Susan and her child, George, were to meet. They had been to the aquarium, and on their way back, George wanted to play catch, so they stopped by this nearby park. That's so, but there's something else I'm curious about. I dropped my gaze. There was George, sticking close to me even though we had never met. He must have turned 5 this year. I've seen his photo with Susan, but for some reason, George looked up at me and seemed happy, calling me daddy. When I asked why, Susan just gave a wry smile in response. Actually, I've explained to George that I have a new husband now, and when I mentioned that he used to play baseball, George said he wanted to play catch with his new dad. Since he had seen your photo before, when we came to the park and he spotted you, he ran straight over. "Is that so? Do you like baseball, George?" When I asked, George nodded happily and said, "Yeah." Then he immediately wanted to play catch and showed me a wiffle ball. I was bewildered by the sudden turn of events, but seeing George's smile made me too tired to think it over. "All right, shall we play?" "Yay, awesome. Kids really don't consider the convenience of adults, do they?" But that's okay. I thought to myself as I played catch with him. After a while, as George started to play on the playground equipment, I walked shoulder to shoulder with Susan. Susan said that young George might not fully grasp what a father is yet. That is, there's only one mom, but there could be more than one dad, and right now, for some reason, mom is living away from him with another dad. That's probably why George so naturally called me daddy, Susan analyzed. It's all my and my ex's fault that he thinks this way. Someday, George will realize how odd his parents are. What am I going to say to apologize to him then? Susan said this, her shoulders drooping. She said she never forgot about George for a moment, and she must have been worrying about her son more than anyone else. Thinking this, I realized her troubles were undoubtedly much greater than mine. I wondered if I had really been able to support her properly. Sorry for meeting with my ex's child. You weren't too happy about that, were you? I was taken aback by Susan's words. I didn't feel that way. I was about to respond, but the words didn't come out. Frankly, I have decided to stay out of George's life. I was somewhat jealous of the child that belonged to Susan and her ex-husband. That feeling must have inadvertently been communicated to her. I now regretted not having fully supported her in that regard. I'm sorry. Maybe I've been pushing you into a corner without realizing it. I'm truly sorry. I couldn't help but let the tears overflow. Then, Susan also began to cry, apologizing for having taken out all her pent-up anxiety on me. Seeing two adults crying side by side in the park, maybe in empathy, George dashed from the top of the slide and clung to Susan, crying even harder than us. Seeing George's reaction, we couldn't help but chuckle. No fighting. As George cried, I patted his head. It's okay. Thanks to you, we've made up now. While laughing, I said thank you. Since meeting George, both my wife and I felt as if a fog had lifted. From then on, I started accompanying Susan to the monthly visits with George. Playing catch with the kid. It was the moment my dream was fulfilled through George. I, who had not thought so highly of George at first, felt truly cleansed at heart when meeting him. Gradually, seeing George became the highlight of my life. I even started to wish that George would really become my son. One day, Susan confided in me. Actually, George mentioned something the other day. His father doesn't seem to come home much anymore. Really? Is that true? When I brought it up with his father, he just insisted that's not true. But considering he always prioritized his work and hobbies over family, it seems suspicious. Susan looked anxiously in George's direction. He seems a bit too skinny. I was worried about whether he was eating properly too. All right, then I've got a good idea. I made a suggestion. That was to hire a private investigator. Yes, the same detective agency I had used before to corner my ex-wife. I asked them for another investigation. We'll take this case for a lower fee this time, the detective said, and then they started tailing Susan's ex-husband. It turned out the ex-husband had a girlfriend he seemed to be seeing, spending every night with her in a hotel. He would come home late at night, and sometimes not until the morning. He left his son, who wasn't even in elementary school, home alone to fend for himself while going out. When Susan learned this fact, she was shaking with anger. He is a man who only thinks of himself. He took away my son's custody because he didn't want to be seen as the ex-husband who took my child away from me. I really can't forgive him. I then made a suggestion to Susan. I talked to the detective, and with this much evidence, we can definitely get the custody back. Really? Go to court? Yes. And then, I want to become George's father. Susan was very surprised by my words. Are you sure that's what you want? Susan asked me. I had no doubts myself. I wanted to live with George. George and Susan. The time the three of us have spent together has become something I can't replace. Can I stand by and protect you both from here on out? To hear you say that, it really means the world to me. She said that with tears streaming down her face. Then, through a detective's connection, I got a lawyer and filed a custody battle against Susan's ex-husband. We went through all sorts of procedures, and the court deemed what Susan's ex did to be child abuse, and luckily, we were granted custody. I thought Susan's ex would put up a huge fight, but he was surprisingly subdued during the trial. It turned out that the woman Susan's ex had been secretly meeting was the wife of a senior executive at a client company. In other words, he was having an affair. So for the ex-husband, it was more problematic for that to come to light than the custody terms, so he agreed to the custody terms on the condition that the affair stayed under wraps. As a victim of his cheating, I was filled with righteous anger and wanted to tell him off, but I held back, thinking of getting George back. But later on, it seems the affair did come out. I heard through the grapevine that the ex lost his job and has been paying a hefty sum in alimony. It seems hiding infidelity is next to impossible. This incident made me sure of that. And so, Susan and we began living peacefully with George. George adapted to the new life quicker than I thought, which was a relief. Having a child changes a couple's life completely. We'll raise George properly. Susan and through this common goal, have become even more cooperative with each other. Both Susan and I have become able to trust people again, thanks undoubtedly to George. What happened to the dad who used to live with me? Sometimes he asks with such innocent eyes that I'm always at a loss for words. Susan and I have talked it over, and we've decided to wait a little longer before explaining his situation to him. I feel guilty for unwittingly pushing George into a complex family environment, but one day, when he's grown up, I hope he can say that being raised in this home was truly the best for him. We are committed to protecting our son with all our might.